This video, I will talk about the history of diagnosis. Um, so a little bit about the history before the DSM, and then we'll talk about the different DSM versions all the way up to the current version of the DSM. So people have been discussing abnormal behavior for a very long time. Over 2,000 years ago, we have Hippocrates' theories. You may have heard of the four humors. This essentially tied abnormality in personality or behavior to natural causes. So things like yellow bile, black bile, blood, phlegm, these were associated with psychopathology. So this was a very, very early categorization system. It certainly does not correspond to modern ideas about how the mind and body work. But this was an early attempt to categorize people into these different areas. Jumping ahead to what we discussed in chapter 2, in the 19th century, there were mental asylums that were often run like prisons, but some of the early reform efforts aimed to introduce categorization systems. So really early ways to kind of start identifying how people are differing in their behaviors and how this might influence treatment. So back then we had Emil Kraepelin, who's kind of considered the founding father of the current diagnostic system. And so what he did is label specific categories that are pretty similar to what we still use today. So things like manic depressive disorder, which is now called bipolar disorder, or dementia praecox, which is now called schizophrenia. He was really the first to kind of group these symptoms together and call them a disorder. From there, in the late 1800s, early 1900s in the US, there started to be an effort to collect larger data sets on people. So things like the census. And as part of the census, they included some items that captured people's either intellectual functioning or having a psychiatric disorder. But it wasn't really until the mid-1900s, corresponding with a lot of those reform efforts that we talked about earlier in the class, kind of this post-World War II period, where the VA is trying to diagnose and treat soldiers that are returning from World War II. They develop their own early categorization system that really is seen as kind of the precursor to the first DSM. And so the first DSM came out in 1952, and the DSM-2 followed in 1968. And these two versions were quite similar to each other, but they're quite different from subsequent DSM editions. So in the DSM-1, there were only 3 main categories. So we had psychoses, which includes all the kind of psychotic disorders. We had neuroses, which would be emotional-based disorders such as depression and anxiety, and then character disorders, which are like modern-day personality disorders. However, these definitions of disorders were not scientifically or empirically based. So they were based on observations from clinicians. And the language that it is written in reflects psychoanalytic approach to understanding people and their problems. And so the psychoanalytic approach is much more rooted in the unconscious, kind of the things that Freud was working on related to the self and people's unconscious motives. This is very different from how the current DSM is written. And so the way that this original DSM was, it kind of had just vague descriptions of clinical conditions described in prose. So there were no specific symptom checklists or criteria. And it wasn't very useful for clinicians. So it was hard to generalize across clients, and it didn't really work as a clinical tool. It was almost more of an encyclopedia or like a reference guide. So then we see a bit of a deviation with the DSM-3. So this was published in 1980. And this time, the diagnostic categories they relied on empirical data. And it included specific diagnostic criteria to define the disorders. So as we see now, we have a disorder, and then it'll list specific criteria to meet that disorder. And so the psychoanalytic language was replaced by broader terminology. And it wasn't necessarily replaced by like strictly behavioral psychology or the medical model, but it was kind of broader. So it wasn't just rooted in psychoanalytic theory. It was much longer than the DSM-1 and 2. So the DSM-3 included 265 diagnoses. And so this was really an expansion. It included many new disorders. Another thing that was introduced in the DSM-3 was the multi-axial assessment system. And so the DSM-3 was organized to have kind of these tiers of diagnoses. So at Axis 1, we had the broad mental health and substance use disorders. This includes a lot of the main diagnoses you may have heard of, such as major depressive disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, as well as the substance use disorders. Then at Axis 2, we have the personality disorders and intellectual developmental disorders. So this would include things, the personality disorders, so things like borderline personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, as well as things like autism or intellectual disabilities. And so in a way, they were saying, mental health and substance use disorders are on Axis 1, and then we're looking at kind of like a different level for these other disorders. Axis 3 included general medical conditions, so this might include sleep or sexual dysfunction. Axis 4 included psychosocial and environmental problems. So this is where a clinician could indicate things such as housing instability or the experience of abuse. And then Axis 5 was called the Global Assessment of Functioning, or the GAF scale, which is sort of a 0 to 100 rating scale to identify a person's kind of overall functioning in society. And this is used to both track the clients over time and compare clients to each other as kind of this quantitative measure. And so in this way, people kind of were assessed across all 5 axes, and it was organized in this very particular way. So then we got a series of revisions. So we had the DSM-3 revised, the DSM-4, and the DSM-4 text revision. And these are all very similar to the DSM-3. There were some significant changes. So something that the DSM-4 brought was that it was created in coordination with the International Classification of Diseases, also known as the ICD. And the ICD is the most used kind of internationally based diagnostic system for medicine. So this includes all the codes and diagnostic criteria across different medical disorders. And so 1994 was the first time that the DSM was intentionally made to be compatible with the ICD, and it still is to this day. Other revisions just included like changing the criteria for certain diagnoses and adding or removing diagnoses. So then that brought us to the DSM-5, which was the first substantial revision after 20 years. So the DSM-5 came out in 2013. This was kind of a big project in the works. They had planned all of these steps to really make the DSM-5 kind of like this new tool for people. So they created a task force with kind of leading psychiatrists. We have various work groups. So, they gather a bunch of depression experts to study depression, a bunch of trauma experts to study PTSD. They created some boards with a scientific review committee to make sure that the decisions made were based in empirical evidence. They plan to do multiple field trials where they would have clinicians in the community start to use the new DSM and make sure that it's reliable, that it's useful. And they developed a website to communicate the progress of the development of the DSM-5 to the public. And I say they're planned steps. We'll talk about in a few minutes about how not everything went according to plan. It was a little bit of a mess and a controversy, but it's helpful to think about, how something as large as the DSM gets developed. And then we got a new version of the DSM, actually. So DSM-5 text revision just came out in 2022. So as I said, the DSM-5 was supposed to be kind of like this big change. Like we hadn't had a new one in 20 years. And they had promised a lot of things that did not come to fruition. So, for example, they had hoped to be able to include biological markers as diagnostic tools. But they really just found that the research just isn't there yet for it to be reliable as a clinical tool. They had hoped to include more rating scales. So rather than having the categories of major depressive disorder or persistent depressive disorder, being able to rate depressive symptoms in a more dimensional way. And overall, having a more dimensional approach towards a disorder. And so what this means is rather than having it be either you meet the criteria or not, you can have like different degrees of a disorder. They had actually proposed to remove half of the personality disorders, but this upset, some people in the clinical psychology world, and so ultimately they did not remove them. And there had been new disorders proposed for inclusion that were ultimately rejected. And they are included in kind of an areas for further study section of the DSM, but they're not included as kind of full diagnoses that can go into a client's chart. So these included things like attenuated psychosis syndrome, which reflects kind of somebody who maybe has some of the symptoms of a psychotic episode, but isn't quite meeting full criteria, but it still warrants clinical attention. But ultimately, they were worried about overdiagnosis and a lack of reliability for this diagnosis. Others include mixed anxiety depressive disorder, because anxiety and depression often are comorbid to each other, so they coexist. But ultimately, this was not included. And then lastly, they wanted to include an internet gaming disorder to reflect kind of video game addiction or electronic addiction. And this was ultimately not included either. So here are some things that they did change in the DSM-5. So one change was they changed the title from having Roman numerals to the number 5. And this isn't just a change in the style of the name. This was intentionally done to encourage more frequent updates and have it be more of a living document. So in theory, the DSM could be housed online, and every year they could kind of make minor updates as new research comes out or as they're still refining the tool. This has not actually happened, though. It's kind of funny. They came out with the DSM-5, and then they called it the DSM-5 text revision instead of the DSM 5.1 or 5.2. So I'm not sure why this kind of title change didn't totally pan out, but I think it's an interesting idea to have it be more of this living document. Another major change is that they dropped that multi-axial assessment system. So DSM-3 and DSM-4 had those axes with like tiers of different levels, but there was no scientific basis for classifying diagnoses in this way. There's nothing to say that personality disorders and intellectual disorders should be in a different category than other mental health disorders. However, if you're going to be working in the mental health field, it's still helpful to know about a lot of electronic medical records still kind of have the AXIS system built into them. So even though we've had the DSM-5 for over 10 years now, I still come across kind of the AXIS system. And so it's helpful to just know what it is. And then the DSM-5 introduced a number of new disorders. So actually, as part of your weekly discussion response this week, you'll get a chance to kind of pick one to read more about. But yeah, so we have premenstrual dysphoric disorder, which is sort of a major depressive episodes that occur corresponding to the menstrual cycle. We have disruptive mood dysregulation disorder, which was kind of nicknamed as baby bipolar or bipolar disorder for kids. But it kind of replaces some of the issues that came about with diagnosing bipolar disorder in children. So it's characterized by large mood swings, but it has kind of its own characteristics specific to children in their developmental period. Binge eating disorder was new. We also have mild neurocognitive disorder, which is sort of a precursor to dementia. Somatic symptom disorder, which reflects when people have kind of physical symptoms that are tied to an emotional cause. We have hoarding disorder. And then we have prolonged grief disorder, which is actually the only diagnostic category that was added in 2022 with the text revision. And this one's kind of interesting. I think there's a lot to discuss because grief is such a cultural phenomenon. So how long should people grieve is kind of up for debate, but I think it is clear that, some people just really get stuck in their grief. And after a period of a year or longer, if they're still having serious distress and dysfunction due to grief, this allows them to kind of access services and have a diagnosis that reflects that. There were also a number of modifications to the DSM-5 with the text revision. I'm not going to go over all the changes. They're listed in your textbook if you're more interested. But it's just some examples. They collapsed autistic disorder, Asperger's disorder, and some related developmental disorders all into autism spectrum disorder. So this was one area in which they did include more of a dimensional disorder. So rather than having these discrete categories, they said, okay, we're going to call it all autism spectrum disorder, but reflect that there's kind of these different severity levels. For anorexia nervosa, they changed the definition of low body weight to being kind of this more specific number, so saying that it had to be less than 85% of an expected body weight, to be broader. And this is because, people who are at normal weight or even people who are overweight or obese can still be diagnosed with anorexia nervosa. It's characterized by patterns of starvation and intentionally trying to lose weight, but they took out that requirement to have that low body weight. And then another notable modification is that they combined substance abuse and substance dependence into one diagnosis called substance use disorder. But there are a number of criticisms of DSM-5, which we already covered a little bit back in chapter 3 when we talked about kind of the overexpansion of mental disorders. But some of the criticisms, so many of the work group members quit halfway because they were not happy with how the DSM-5 was being developed. So a lot of people were really looking forward to those drastic changes, like having it be more dimensional, having it include more measures, and that just wasn't panning out, and a lot of people got frustrated and quit. Some leaders of mental health organizations actually boycotted the DSM-5. We are kind of all using it now just because it's so tied to like insurance systems, and a lot of broader mental health systems like rely on having a diagnostic system. But while it was being created, there were boycotts. You might remember the name Alan Francis from chapter 3. He had been the chair of the task force for the DSM-4, and he was a very, very vocal critic of the DSM-5. So he believed that a lot of the changes were not based in science, and that he believed that the DSM-5 would mislabel normal people, promote that kind of diagnostic inflation by adding too many disorders, and encourage inappropriate medication use. And so there were some other criticisms. So again, that diagnostic overexpansion. So thinking about diagnoses as kind of these social constructs. So people create a diagnosis, and it can reflect a real life underlying phenomenon. But where do we draw that line? Kind of thinking about that last video, like how do we decide what is abnormal versus normal can be a big point of contention among people. There was also criticism about the lack of transparency of the revision process. So they were supposed to have it up on a website and be delivering regular reports, and that just didn't happen as planned. There was criticism of who was on the work groups. So some people noted that people were on, getting money from big pharmaceutical companies, and that might create some bias. There were problems with field trials. So testing the DSM in a real life setting, and it actually didn't go very well. And then they actually canceled one of the field trials. So that also did not go according to plan. And then lastly, it's been criticized for its price, because almost everyone working in the mental health field needs to own the DSM. It's kind of like this required tool, and it's quite expensive. So even though the DSM is still definitely the #1 tool for diagnosis, it's helpful to think about other directions in diagnosis and classification, because there are a lot of efforts to develop a better alternative. And so when we think about the DSM, the current DSM really takes a categorical approach. So what this means is it makes a binary distinction. Either a person meets the criteria for a disorder or they do not. And this really maps onto the medical model and how people have historically thought about disease and health. Although I'll note that I think there are also shifts going on in the medical world where we're seeing more of a dimensional approach between disease and health as well. The alternative to this categorical approach would be to take a dimensional approach. So in a dimensional approach, symptoms fall on a continuum of severity. So we can think about something like personality traits. So introversion and extroversion, we all can be measured in a certain way on that scale. And so it's really, we can take the general population, measure it, and say that, we have some people who are maybe at the extremes, but everyone falls somewhere on the line. And so a dimensional approach to psychopathology would be taking the same approach to anxiety or depression or even something like psychosis. We can measure it in the general population, and this is going to better reflect how we conceptualize psychological distress. I think this is really helpful to think about also is how psychologists think about psychological distress and mental disorders versus psychiatrists. When we think about psychological theories, we're talking a lot about psychological mechanisms that we all experience. And a dimensional approach may better reflect this conceptualization. A dimensional approach can still coexist with a categorical approach. So for example, in psychosis, which my background is in, we have categorical diagnoses such as schizophrenia, but we also recognize that these things happen on a continuum. So when someone is first developing psychosis, they are maybe starting to hear voices, but it wouldn't be categorized as a full psychotic episode. However, we can still say there is a meaningful distinction between somebody who has experienced a full psychotic episode versus not. And so in the psychosis world of treatment and diagnosis, people often talk about kind of this dimensional approach while still recognizing categories. So the main attempt to organize mental health disorders into a more dimensional approach is called the hierarchical taxonomy of psychopathology, or HITOP for short. It's quite complicated. So the people who work on HITOP are all academic researchers, and they take a very data-driven approach to understanding how symptoms kind of organize with each other. So you don't need to know all the details, but just knowing that it's kind of this attempt to organize psychopathology in a more dimensional way. And so there's 5 levels. They have kind of symptoms or specific traits that cluster together into syndromes or disorders, that cluster together into subfactors, spectra, and then at the very top, there's kind of this P factor, which refers to like a general psychopathology that you can measure across people. So an example would be the way the DSM currently categorizes PTSD and depression. They're kind of these 2 separate categories. A person could meet both diagnoses, but they likely have specific symptoms that overlap with both. So things like dissociation or social anhedonia, which is kind of like a reduced drive to socialize, or having low positive affect. These are kind of part of both PTSD and depression. And so to say that there's these kind of 2 separate categories doesn't always make sense. And so HITOP would kind of look at these very specific symptoms rather than looking at the larger categories. So this is an example of how they've organized it. Again, you don't need to know the ins and outs of this, but it's just helpful to know about that this is kind of a future direction in this area. Here's an example of how HITOP is organizing psychosis. So instead of just calling it psychosis, we have these very specific kind of traits and symptoms associated with it. Things like fantasy proneness, unusual experiences, reality distortion. We also have things like inexpressivity, emotional detachment, romantic disinterest. And each of these all kind of come together to be part of this larger psychosis category, but each individual person might experiencing these specific symptoms at a different level. We also have what's called the Research Domain Criteria, or RDoC. And this was developed by the National Institute of Mental Health. And this is really based in a biomedical model of psychopathology, where the goal is to really better understand the neurological and developmental factors that contribute to mental illness. This is notably much more focused on research applications, so it doesn't have very much clinical utility, but it's a way to help organize research so that we're kind of all working together to really focus in on the things that need to be studied. So what we have is these very specific domains. So negative valence refers to just kind of negative emotions, positive valence, cognitive systems, which would include things like memory or attention, systems for social processing, and then arousal and modulatory systems. So very neurologically based. And what RDoC is trying to do is organize all of our research information across these different levels of analyses. So going from genes, molecules, cells, neural circuits, the physiological systems, behavior, all the way up to self-report. And these are kind of like the specific constructs that RDoC is attempting to study across these different levels of analysis. So kind of these broad things like the fear response or reward learning or perception or attention, and how these relate to mental illness. So it's really getting at those like roots of human behavior and mental illness.